Last summer, I was in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, which does have these magnificent old manuscripts, and the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts was digitizing these and their other Greek New Testament manuscripts. We spent a month there, 6 of us, and one day they had a heat advisory. It was the first heat advisory ever in the country of Ireland. And the warning was, people don't get out of your house for more than 20 minutes at a time. It's going to be too hot. It'll be too dangerous because the temperature will be as high as 80 degrees. That's the truth. It's actually colder in Dallas right now than it is here. And so I think the heat you have here is my fault. It got up to 77 degrees just a couple of days ago in Dallas. I said, what happened to the summer? I want some heat. Lord, I want it to get warmer. So he brought me here. So you can blame me for this heat wave. Well, I want to talk to you today and tomorrow in chapel about how much and how badly the scribes corrupted the New Testament. I'm dealing with the issues of how reliable are our books that we have today, our New Testaments that we hold in our hands. How reliable are these in terms of going back to the original text? Today, the issue is how much did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? And I'm going to be dealing with the number of what's known as textual variants, and we'll talk about why we have so many. And tomorrow in chapel, I will be talking about how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament. The issue there has to do with the nature of these variants. Does it affect doctrine? Is the virgin birth in jeopardy? How about the deity of Christ? Are these doctrines based on passages that are only found in manuscripts where there's some doubt as to whether that's what the original text said? I think these are very important questions for us to wrestle with and think about and make sure that our faith is grounded solidly. So today is the first part of that. I realize you have your choice of chapels and you can go to whatever you want. So this will be self-contained, but I'd sure like to see you back tomorrow too. All right, let me start by quoting from that great scholar Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code when he said, "The Bible has evolved through countless translations, editions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." In a sense, that's true that it has gone through a number of translations, editions, and revisions, but what the implication is that Brown is suggesting here is we can't possibly tell what the original text said. You all have heard that. You all have non-Christian friends. Some of you, before you became Christians, asked that question. Some of you, after you became Christians, asked that question. Hasn't the Bible been changed so much that we can't possibly get back to the original? We're going to wrestle with that issue this morning. Now, it's not just Dan Brown, but atheists are also joining the chorus. C.J. Werleman is a man who wrote a book called Jesus Lied. He likes provocative titles for his books, by the way. He's an outspoken atheist, and his first book was God Hates You, Hate Him Back. Now think about this. He's an atheist. God hates you. So maybe what he means is nobody hates you and hate nobody back. I'm not sure, but nevertheless, it's interesting how atheists are so angry at a God whom they say does not exist. Nevertheless, Werleman has written in his book, Jesus Lied, we do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. That's true. The originals are lost. Also true. We don't know by when and we don't know by whom. Correct. What we have are copies of copies. Right. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. I have no idea where he got that from. Boom, 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 right in the row. You see all these true statements. Then the last one, he just made that up out of thin air. But there are some others who are making the same kind of a case. Muslims who have made quite a bit of news recently have argued against this. And in one of the classes I'll be teaching this week, I'll be talking a little bit about Muslim apologists. I think maybe that's tonight's After Dark Chapel. I'll be talking a little bit about that. But M.M. Azami is a British Muslim apologist whose book, The History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation, has been a very good seller in England. And here's what he claims. The Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God, but a man. Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man, and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. Catch the import of what he's claiming here. Early Christian scribes have so corrupted the Bible that they have distorted the face of Jesus. He's not who you think he is what M.M. al-Azmi is claiming. They have radically changed the text so that the Jesus that Christians worship should not be worshiped because he was just a man. Well, where do these people get these ideas from? None of them is a biblical scholar, certainly not Brown, not Werleman, not al-Azmi. They do get them from some biblical scholars who are agnostic or atheist, who have made some claims. And let me give an example of one of these, Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's been a friend of mine for about 33 years. Bart went to Moody Bible Institute. He had a very strong conversion in high school, went to Moody, then to Wheaton College. After that, he got his master's and doctor's degree at Princeton Seminary, studying under the great evangelical scholar, Dr. Bruce Metzger at Princeton. And then a few years later, his faith began to erode, and today he claims to be an agnostic. Bart wrote this book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And in the book he says, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. Sounds like what Werleman said, right? Werleman got it from this source. And this is as far as Ehrman goes. There's no 20 generations of copies that we're missing. But even what he says here, that we don't have copies of the copies of the copies of the originals, that gives an impression about what we have that is really quite errant. Ehrman goes on, and towards the end of the book he says, the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws for them. Dr. Ehrman is saying what M.M. al-Azmi said, that the text has been changed, deliberately corrupted by Orthodox, so-called Orthodox scribes who changed the text so that it looked like what their theology wanted it to look like. Well, let's see how accurate this is. There's two attitudes we want to avoid this morning and tomorrow in chapel. One is radical skepticism. I've just given you three representatives of radical skepticism. And the other attitude is absolute certainty. This is an attitude that most of you are going to fall prey to. You walk to church with your NIV or ESV, not realizing that those translations undergo a process, and the scholars had to wrestle with various textual problems as to what they thought was original, and they're not absolutely certain about it. In the original King James Bible, there were 8,000 marginal notes, many of which were saying, we're not sure if the wording here is this or this. And in the NIV of 1984, it was different in many places than what it is today in the NIV 2011. They have made textual changes. They are translating a different Greek or Hebrew text than they did just 30 years ago. So we can't have absolute certainty that what I hold in my hands today is the very Word of God in every single jot and tittle. But is it in all essentials the Word of God? And what's really at stake? Those are the things we'll be discussing. Well, we have two attitudes to avoid and four questions to answer, only one of which is going to be answered this morning, but it's the longest one that I want to spend time on. How many textual variants are there is the first question. Secondly, what kinds of textual variations are there? In other words, what is affected? How important is this in terms of the meaning of the text and maybe even theological issues? And that leads to the third one. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? Do you want to know if the deity of Christ is something that's absolutely secure in the manuscripts? That's kind of important to know, don't you think? I hope so. I hope you want to know that, because our faith depends on what the Bible actually says. And finally, has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes, like these folks have claimed that is the case? Well, let me begin by talking about a preliminary question. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? By the way, when I give lectures, I usually have preface that takes about 3/4 of the time, and then we close in prayer, and then we never get to the real meat of it. But and we're running out of time, but that's okay. The first question is, don't we have the original New Testament anymore? We have a church father by the name of Tertullian, who at the end of the 2nd century said, you can go and see the original letter to the Ephesians or to the Romans or to the Corinthians. They're there at the churches. Most scholars think he was exaggerating, but there was this desire to have those original documents. Some think it's been mistranslated. But the fact is that almost surely by the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, all of our original New Testament manuscripts turned to dust. Why? Because people kept copying them. Somebody makes a visit to Rome and he says, I don't have a copy of Romans. I know Paul wrote a letter. Can I see your document? So he scribbles it out on a papyrus roll. Another one goes to Corinth and he wants to see their manuscript. Others are going to Ephesus and Thessaloniki, places like this, or Thessalonica in the ancient world. And they're making these copies. Yes, it's true. We don't have the original copies, the original manuscripts, or the first generation copies. But what we do have are a number of copies that are maybe 3rd or 4th or 5th generation that go back to the original, not in a straight line of transmission. In other words, this is not like the telephone game where you have the original manuscript and you're whispering to somebody what the text is and whispering down the line, and all we have is that 4th person or 5th or 6th person in line. What we've got is multiple lines growing out from that, and we can compare these texts and see what the original text says. But we no longer have the original manuscripts. So that's one reason why we have to do what's called textual criticism. The other reason is that the manuscripts are all corrupt. There are no 2 Greek New Testament manuscripts that are exactly alike. In fact, the 2 earliest that are the closest to each other for the first 800 years differ between 6 and 10 times per chapter. If you multiply that out by 260 chapters, that means we've got approximately 2,000 differences between the 2 closest related manuscripts. So because of the disappearance of the originals, and because of the discrepancies among the copies, we have to do the science of textual criticism to get back to the original text. Well, let me talk to you about the number of variants, and that's what I'm going to occupy my time with for the rest of this morning. What is a textual variant? It's any place among the manuscripts in which there is variation in wording, including word order, omission or addition of words, even spelling differences. But there's a few things that we don't count as textual variants. We don't count punctuation. Why? Because the oldest manuscripts don't have any punctuation, and presumably the originals didn't either. We also don't count word breaks, because the original manuscripts, the ancient manuscripts for hundreds of years of all sorts of traditions, had no word breaks between them. People knew how to read them because Greek words can only end in certain letters, and there was a certain cadence they could figure out. There's no such thing as capitalization in the ancient manuscripts. Or I should say there's no such thing as lowercase, because everything was capitalized. And so we don't have capitalization, we don't have word breaks, we don't have punctuation, but everything else counts as a textual variant. So how many do we have? In the Greek New Testament, we have approximately 140,000 words. Now, for those of you who are more anal, it's okay to use that word. 138,162 words. Now, don't ask me how I know that, but I will tell you the first time I went to Chavez Ravine to see a Dodger baseball game when I was 8 years old, it was a twilight doubleheader, and some of you old-timers, namely professors, may remember the names Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax, and they were both pitching, and Sandy Koufax set a record for the National League in terms of strikeouts. We got all done with the game, and my dad said, "So, son, what'd you think of the game?" I said, I don't remember. "What? You were here for 6 hours." Well, Dad, did you know that there's 156,800 lights in Dodger Stadium and that 712 of them are burned out? That's what I was thinking about. Anyway, I probably told you more about me than I should have. So we have approximately 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament. When we look at all of the manuscripts and compare them to each other, the differences among them, and I'm not saying differences where we've got 10 manuscripts that say one thing, that counts as 10 differences. I'm saying all of the differences among all of our manuscripts come to approximately 400,000. That means for every word in the Greek New Testament, there's approximately 2.5 variants we find among the manuscripts, 2.5 differences. That's an astounding number. And it looks like my time's up. Let's close in prayer. No, I'm going to tell you the good news now. This is where these skeptics love to go to this point here and no further. But we're going to look at the rest of the story. The reason that we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts, and I mean a lot of manuscripts. Let me just give you some comparisons here, but let me point out what Richard Bentley said 301 years ago. He was a great scholar who worked on the manuscripts of the Bible, and he's universally respected by liberals and conservatives alike. He said if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek New Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, this is when the first Greek New Testament was published in 1516, he's talking about, then we would have had no various readings at all. You have one manuscript, you don't have any differences from it, just the one. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now that we have 30,000 variant readings? At this point, a man by the name of John Mill had spent his entire adult life looking at 100 manuscripts and cataloging all the differences. He found 30,000 of them. What Bentley says is, it's good therefore to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. When John Mill wrote his 2-volume work on the New Testament, published in 1707, it created quite a furor among a lot of Protestants. Some of them said this was the work of the devil because he had actually looked at biblical manuscript and noticed the difference. I wouldn't call that the work of the devil. But Mill never defended himself because 2 weeks after his magnum opus was published, he died. When I get my magnum opus published, I want to die 2 weeks later so I don't have to deal with all the critics. So he timed it just perfectly. But what we have for New Testament manuscripts is an embarrassment of riches. The latest number on our Greek New Testament manuscripts comes to 5,839. Almost 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts are known to exist. When I went through Biola, there were 4,800 that were known to exist. I believe there's another 1,000 left to be discovered. My institute, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, has found already 77 Greek New Testament manuscripts. And there's far more to be discovered, especially in the old Soviet bloc countries. The average size Greek New Testament manuscript is 459 pages long. They date from the early 2nd century all the way up to the 18th century. Now, the New Testament was translated into a number of languages early on. Latin being the first, we have more than 10,000 manuscripts of the New Testament written in Latin. It's a huge number because Latin became the lingua franca of Western Europe very quickly after it was translated. Other ancient languages like Coptic and Syriac and Georgian and Gothic and Armenian and Old Church Slavonic, we have somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. These are conservative numbers, by the way. These are the numbers that I've used when I've debated skeptics, and they have never disputed them. Now, if you had a magic wand and could wipe out all of these manuscripts, we still would not be left without a witness. And that's because of people known as church fathers who wrote commentaries and theological treatises and homilies on the New Testament. And the church fathers did not have the gift of brevity. We have over 1 million quotations by these church fathers from the New Testament throughout the history of when the church fathers were writing. Now, when there's 7,941 verses in the New Testament, and we have over 1 million quotations by the church fathers, you can well imagine that some of these verses are quoted many, many times over. And they're discussed, they're analyzed. It's amazing the data we have. So we could reproduce the entire New Testament many times over, virtually on the basis of just what the church fathers themselves quoted. Now, how does this compare to the average classical work? The average classical writer has less than 20 copies of his writing still in existence. In fact, that's a very generous number for the average classical author. But you stack those books up, they'd be about right to here, about 4 feet high. How high do you think the New Testament stack would be? You think it would hit the ceiling? Well, let's take a look. That's not quite right. Let's add a little bit more to the there we go. Add some more to the New Testament stack. You know, that's as much as I wanted to do in PowerPoint. It's not even close. It needs to be multiplied by 8 to 10. It's over a mile high. Over 1 mile high of manuscripts. In fact, if you were to stack them up, the latest figures are that it would be about 6,600 feet high. So much more than a mile, over a mile and a quarter high. It's remarkable. So we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament. Well, let me compare the New Testament to some better known Greco-Roman authors, historians and biographers. Pliny the Elder. We're waiting 700 years before we get any copies of his manuscript. But we do have about 200 of them. That's a really large number. Plutarch, we're waiting 800 years before we get a single manuscript. Josephus, we're waiting 800 years. Josephus is the one who wrote about Jewish antiquities, where he mentions John the Baptist, James, the brother of the Lord, and this guy named Jesus in his Antiquities, book 18. We only have 26 copies, or 20 copies of his writings, I think. Polybius, we're waiting 1,200 years. Pausanias wrote the Geography of Greece 1,400 years before we get a single copy. Herodotus, who's one of the great fathers of historiography in the 5th century BC, we are waiting 1,500 years before we get any copy of any substantial length. 1,500 years before we get the first copy of Herodotus of any substantial length, more than just some minor fragments. And Xenophon's Hellenica, we're waiting 1,800 years before we get a manuscript of more than just some minor fragments. Now think about that. If that were the case for the New Testament, that would be like saying our first copy of more than just a few verses was written at about the same time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Now let that sink in for a moment. That's a great illustration to use with someone. Xenophon scholars don't say, we give up our hands, we have no idea what Xenophon actually wrote. They have some pretty fair confidence that what they have is largely what he actually wrote, even though they're waiting 1,800 years. New Testament scholars don't have to wait that long, and yet skeptics are literally 1,000 times more skeptical about the New Testament than they are other ancient writings, because we have, on average, 1,000 times more evidence for the New Testament than we do these other ancient authors. What about the date of the earliest New Testament manuscripts? Well, we have the discovery of P52, which I'll just tell you about very briefly. This was discovered in 1934. It is to date still our oldest known Greek New Testament manuscript. It's just a fragment, looks like this, about the size of a credit card, and it was discovered at Manchester University. A scholar by the name of C.H. Roberts was working in a box of papyri, and he found this thing and discovered that it had John 18, verses 31 through 33 on this side, the back side, verses 37 and 38. That told him it was written on a codex. Our modern book, you know, it's bound on one side, pages that flip. You don't know what that is. You all use a roll because you use computers and that goes retro on us. But nevertheless, you're scrolling, you know. Never mind, it's a bad joke. But this was the modern book that Christians did not invent, but they were the first ones to popularize. Through the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, 80% of all Christian books were written on a codex. 20% of all non-Christian books were written on a codex. C.H. Roberts sent this to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time and said, tell me your best estimate on the date. All 3 of them wrote back independently and said, should be dated no later than AD 150. But we think it's probably closer to 100. Now, there was a scholar named F.C. Bauer whose writings for 90 years had persuaded scholars that John's gospel should not be dated any earlier than AD 160. Now, I don't know about the education you get here, but when I was here, I was told that generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not produced before the original of that manuscript. I think that's maybe the same here. That's what I learned in school. And this one single small shred of a manuscript sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. It's an ounce of evidence. It's worth a pound of presumption. Within 150 years of the New Testament's completion, over 40% of all the verses are found. And what's really, really interesting, in the last 150 years, when all the papyri have been discovered, there's not been a single new reading that has committed itself that was not already known in some other manuscripts. In other words, we have the original text somewhere in our Greek New Testaments, either in the text or in the footnotes. It's in one of those 2 places. So, has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Let me just show you this one graph. This is of the King James Bible. They did it on 7 manuscripts, based it on that for the New Testament. We have over 5,800, almost 1,000 times as many. The earliest came from the 11th century, our earliest from the 2nd. And so the bottom line is that as time goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther away.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.